Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last unit, O Theophilus, we studied the westward expansion and the rural interests of Americans at the years right after Reconstruction. In this unit, we move to the city and beyond as we focus on urbanization and the growth of urban centers in the United States, but also the growing imperial movement as the United States expands beyond its borders and reaches its influence a little bit beyond what we would traditionally think of as American history to the broader world sphere. So, dear student, incline your ear and hear our stories so that you may find your place among his delights. We have 5 objectives today crowded into this episode. You should be able to, number 1, explain the growth of steel production in the United States. 2, analyze the role of energy production and the way it affected the way people lived and worked. 3, explain how electricity production affected people's home and work lives. 4, summarize the emergence and growth of unions. And 5, explain the violent reactions of industry and government to any union strikes. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. In 1887, prospectors discovered iron ore deposits more than 100 miles long and up to 3 miles wide over in the state of Minnesota. Its discovery coincided with a boom in coal production, growing from 33 million tons of coal produced in 1870 to more than 250 million tons of coal produced by the turn of the century. Iron is a dense metal. It's fragile. And it's kind of hard to use. If you can remove the carbon from the iron, that makes steel. And steel is a lighter, more flexible, and far more durable metal than iron is. But refining iron into steel, it was a pretty inefficient process until a British manufacturer named Henry Bessemer and an American named William Kelly developed the Bessemer process, which Bessemer process injects air into molten iron. It fires a blast of air through basically liquid iron, and that blows out the impurities. And by 1880, U.S. manufacturers were using that Bessemer process to make about 90% of American steel, though it was eventually replaced by the open hearth process, which was even more efficient. That made steel also from other scrap metals. Then the railroad era happens about the same time as these new methods of steel production. And at first, the railroad was the biggest use of steel, railroad tracks. Then barbed wire and farm machineries, they transformed the plains using steel. And steel building construction, it included the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883, and it spanned more than 1,500 feet, almost 1,600 feet across the East River of New York City. Its steel cables were supported by towers higher than any other man-made weight-bearing structure since the Egyptian pyramids. About the same time, steel became the frame for skyscraper construction, and supporting buildings with an internal steel structure instead of like holding it up by the outside walls, it meant that buildings could reach to record new heights. And this is where we meet an industrialist named Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland to penniless parents, and at 12 years old, he and his family immigrated to the United States in 1848. By the time he was 18, he had turned himself into a private secretary to a local leader in the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he famously helped fix a snarl of passenger and railroad freight trains, whereupon his boss allowed the young man to thank you for your help in untangling this network, allowed him to buy stock in the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. His mother mortgaged their house to go buy the shares, and eventually that made Carnegie into a self-made, rags-to-riches millionaire. In 1873, Carnegie entered the steel business, and by 1899, the Carnegie Steel Company made more steel than the entire country of Great Britain did, and they were once the greatest producer of the product. Carnegie hired talented staff, he offered company stock to his employees, and he promoted competition of ideas among his workers. Carnegie became famous for the use of what we know today as vertical integration. That was that he wanted to control all parts of the steelmaking process. He had suppliers to bring in materials, but he bought out the suppliers so that he could control them. That allowed him to control all of the phases of steel production. He also used another method called horizontal integration, where he bought out his competitors, eventually controlling almost entirely the whole steel industry. But we usually associate Carnegie with the vertical integration that really made his business great. Roman numeral number 2. Here I want to talk about the oil, business and also social Darwinism. We'll get there in a second. Native Americans had been making fuel and medicines from oil, from petroleum, long before Europeans arrived. But early American settlers had no use for the stuff. By the 1840s, Americans were able to use petroleum to refine it into kerosene, and the kerosene be used for lamps. But in 1859, an inventor named Edwin Drake made petroleum cheap because he was able to use a steam engine to go drill for and pump out oil. Edmund Drake kicked off an oil boom that spread from Ohio to Texas, with petroleum refineries turning oil into kerosene and later into gasoline. America's preferred oil was whale oil, a product of like hunting whales in the ocean, made from rendered blubber. But whale oil was expensive, and there was a shortage during the Civil War, and that pushed Americans to go experiment with emerging products such as kerosene. And in 1870, John D. Rockefeller took advantage of the whale oil shortage and the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania to develop his kerosene and oil refining business. Rockefeller's company, called Standard Oil of Ohio, it adopted vertical integration measures, just like Carnegie did, to establish, basically would take these smaller companies and merge them together into a single corporation, and that would create a new system for distributing oil. But Rockefeller's lawyers also created a new legal form known as the trust. That term trust will get used a few different times in American history, but this is really like where it emerges onto the scene. In the Rockefeller model, a trust was a legal company that could manage a lot of different firms, but manage them as if they were a single entity. So they, Rockefeller's controlling a lot of different companies, but he's really managing it as if it was a single company. The companies didn't technically merge, but they acted as if they did. And that allowed Rockefeller to gain total control of the oil industry in America. And here we find that Rockefeller uses a different model. He really leans into the horizontal integration, where he's trying to control all of the distribution of oil in the whole country. Yes, he also uses some vertical integration like Carnegie does, but really popularizes horizontal integration as well. Rockefeller profited by paying low wages to his employees and then underselling all of his competitors. That allowed Rockefeller to drive competitors out of the market. And once that he had chased off anybody doing business against him, he raised the prices because he was the sole supplier of the oil in the town. Other companies soon followed, and they created similar trusts in linseed oil and sugar and salt production. By the time we get to World War I, which is still a couple of units away, but by the time we get to World War I, Singer, Ford, and General Electric had become world-known companies. And despite resentment towards large corporations and their excessive power, America's largest 100 companies controlled a third of the whole productive capacity of the country by 1900. Businesses tried to control industry with mergers. They tried to buy out their competitors. Buying out all the others would form these monopolies, and that would lead to total control of production, total control of wages, and a total control of prices. These holding companies would buy out the stock of other companies. Critics of this system called these industrialists the robber barons as an insult. They were like barons in a feudal system, but instead of even inheriting their wealth, they robbed the public to take it. But industrialists also became philanthropists, giving away tremendous amounts of wealth to go create universities and hospitals and foundations. And a lot of those leaders take on a more flattering nickname. They're referred to as captains of industry. Subpoint D, also called social Darwinism or social evolution. This idea of the market deciding who's going to succeed or fail was a misapplied understanding of biological evolution. Biological evolution, that the best adapted animal would survive. People took that scientific principle and tried to push it into society as well. The idea of survival and success of the most capable appealed to wealthy people, these industrialists, these captains of industry, these robber barons, because they thought that it was a way of justifying their success as just a fact of nature. They're more adapted to succeed than anybody else. Some people saw it as a validation of an old American idea thought of as the Protestant work ethic, that riches were a sign of God's favor. And therefore, if anybody was not rich, if they were poor, then it must be because they're either lazy or just inferior. Economists use social Darwinism to justify an economic practice that still exists today known as laissez-faire government action. Laissez-faire is basically the hands off the government. The government should not manage anything of the economy. It's a let it go or let it be kind of action. That then the successful businesses will make money and the unsuccessful businesses will fail, and the people that are good at making money will get rich and the people that aren't good at making money will be poor, and that you just shouldn't interrupt it. Just let science and nature work its way out. On the other hand, though, monopolies really did hurt the consumer because businesses weren't competing in the marketplace. There was no survival of the fittest because there's no competition left in the marketplace. And the government thought that expanding corporations, if corporations got too big, they would eventually stifle out competition. And so they passed the law known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act said that business trusts were illegal if they interfered with free trade. So a trust could continue to exist, but as soon as it threatened the competition of the market, then it's an illegal trust. Prosecuting companies, though, was pretty difficult. The Sherman Antitrust Act just didn't have a lot of teeth to the law, and so the government basically stopped enforcing the act altogether. Subpoint E, that business boom that's going on around the country, honestly, it bypasses the South. The South had long been languishing even before the era of the Civil War, but after the Civil War, it was hurt by this lack of capital. There's just not enough money in the South to really get much going. The North owned 90% of the stock in the railroads, the biggest industry that there was. The most profitable Southern businesses were also railroad, but they were owned by Northerners. Southern businesses had a whole bunch of problems: high transportation costs, tariffs, few skilled workers, and so while the economy expands in certain parts of the country, the South continues to languish. Roman numeral number 3. Americans considered successful inventors to be basically like American heroes. New technologies like Christopher Sholl's 1867 typewriter and the 1876 telephone invented by Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson, they had major changes for Americans, and particularly major changes in the workplace. And as office work changed, it opened up brand new jobs for women. By 1910, around 40% of clerical workers were women. And by 1890, this increased work efficiency was having real effects on American workers, so much so that a person could get the job accomplished in less amount of time, so much so that the average work week in the United States by 1890 was reduced by 10 hours a week. And as the United States industrialized, the terms like the middle class and the working class, they came into use as people could understand a greater social and economic stratification in the country. Subpoint B. The most famous of all of these inventors was a person named Thomas Edison, and he operated an independent laboratory rather than working for a corporation. Edison basically worked for himself. Edison, like a lot of the era's businessmen, he was a shrewd entrepreneur. He focused on his commercial successes. He and his colleagues helped introduce amazing products to the world, like the incandescent light bulb and the phonograph, both things that would become anachronistic in my lifetime, and moving pictures. And in the late 1870s, Edison claimed that he would light up the world with his incandescent lights and direct current power. He decided to electrify a square mile of the Lower East Side in New York City to just show off his plan. He's going to pick the biggest city and go turn on the lights in a whole square mile of it. And he built this massive infrastructure program. He had to dig up city streets and install 80,000 feet of insulated copper wire below the surface of the streets, and then he had to build a power generating station in the neighborhood to make it work. The project would illuminate a square mile of Manhattan, including the offices of J.P. Morgan, the bank who financed it, and the New York Times, whose coverage of the event basically gave him free publicity. Edison knew how to go work his crowd. Ultimately, though, Edison lost what was known as the War of the Currents to his former employee-turned-rival, Nikola Tesla, whose alternating current model proved to be more stable and more scalable. Still, though, interesting fact, the parts of the direct current grid were still in use in New York City until 2007. Electricity allowed manufacturers to locate their plants anywhere, rather than being tied to energy sources like rivers, and allowed new industries to grow. Electricity changed the United States. By 1890, it ran all kinds of machines, and once it was available in homes, electrical availability encouraged the invention of more home appliances. Roman numeral number 4. Here I want to talk about the development of labor unions. And to me, it's no surprise that labor unions as an organizing unit of workers occurs at the same time that Americans introduce terms like the working class. I hate to say that it's a class struggle issue, but to me, the way they coincide at the same time is Americans understanding stratification, but also how they fit into the rest of the economy and society as a whole. In subpoint A, let's talk about the long hours and danger to workers. Northern wages were generally higher than southern wages, but exploitation and unsafe conditions, they united workers no matter what region they were in. Most workers had 12-hour days and 6-day work weeks. It was like being a high school history teacher. They did repetitive, mind-dulling tasks with no benefits like vacation or sick leave or injury compensation if they got hurt while they're at work. To survive, though, families needed all their members to go work, including the children. But sweatshops and tenement workshops, they were really the only jobs that the children or women could get, and they required few skills, and they paid the lowest. Subpoint B, this is where we meet the National Labor Union. It was the first large-scale nationwide labor union. In 1868, the NLU got Congress to give 8-hour days to civil servants. So here they don't pass an 8-hour law that's like everybody has to go, 8 hours is the maximum. But they do say civil servants. If you're going to work for the government, an 8-hour day is your work day. The National Labor Union focused on linking existing local unions, and the NLU, honestly, it was a segregated union. It prohibited African American members. While the NLU does some great things working for, the change of labor conditions, it does have some holes in it. The Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, such a majestic name. It was a union that was open to everybody, to women, to black people, to unskilled workers. Anybody could be a member of the Knights of Labor. They also supported an 8-hour day, not just for civil service workers, but for everybody. Also equal pay and arbitration, that you can go and get some people to argue on your behalf. Here you find that the labor unions begin to diverge and go in different paths. Craft unions and skilled workers from one or more trades, they kind of like run together, and they join in a group known as the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, organized under the AFL leader, a guy named Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers used collective bargaining to go get better wages, better hours, and working conditions. Gompers says that all employees are going to work together, and they will, agree collectively to go get better wages or better working conditions. You don't just have one department or one group arguing for better wages. All of the workers argue collectively for better wages. Collective bargaining becomes like the key piece of labor movement. And the AFL under Gompers is the one that kind of pioneers this move. Industrial unions, on the other hand, they included skilled and unskilled workers in an entire industry. The most famous of these was a guy named Eugene V. Debs. Remember his name. Eugene V. Debs formed the American Railway Union and effectively used worker strikes to go make their arguments as well. Now, the International Workers of the World was another union, and this one becomes the most edgy. The Knights of Labor kind of was a big union and it sort of burned itself out. The IWW was definitely the vanguard of the labor movement. And labor activists, they were really essentially turning towards socialism, promoting government control of businesses and property in order to get an equal distribution of wealth. The Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, you also hear them called the Wobblies. The IWW formed in 1905, and it was organized by radical unionists and socialists. The IWW was an integrated union. It also included African Americans. Roman numeral number 5. Here we see how these arguments for labor unions, sometimes turn violent. And we'll start with the Great Strike of 1877. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad went on strike to go protest their second wage cut in 2 months. So people that were working there got their wages cut once and then again 2 months later. And then, so they go on strike. They basically said, if we're going to continue to work, we want more pay, and if you're not going to pay us more, then we're not going to go continue to work. And they all walk off the job at the same time. And they create this work stoppage, which started in the B&O Railroad. You ever play Monopoly? The B&O Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and then it spread to other lines, and it caused freight and passenger traffic to basically shut down for 50,000 miles and stopped for an entire week. Governor said that the strike, this B&O strike, was impeding interstate commerce, which is not untrue. It is a railroad. It crosses the lines. But now you have governors saying if it crosses interstate lines, then it's a federal government issue, and the federal government can use troops to go force these people back to work and get the economy moving again. So they called for federal troops to intervene and ultimately end the strike. That strike, though, was effective at drawing public attention, and encouraged by the 1877 strike, 3,000 protesters gathered in Chicago at the Haymarket Square to go protest their police brutality. They say that the police are going in there threatening the working people who want to go stand up for their rights and to go protest the mistreatment of the little guy at the hands of the powerful. And the protest was a peaceful protest. Still, though, nervous policemen descended on the protest saying, we need to break it up. We need to get rid of this. And those nervous policemen coming into what was a peaceful but not happy moment, it sparked violence against the police. In the ensuing violence, 8 people were charged, ultimately convicted, and ultimately executed for inciting the Haymarket riots. Public opinion, which was favorable to the police, turned against labor unions, and labor unions were seen as the angry mob. Subpoint C. In 1892, Carnegie Steel went on strike to go on strike over pay cuts. So Carnegie, biggest steel producer in the country, his workers also were seeing pay cuts, and they went on strike. The company president, a guy named Henry Frick, he's hired armed guards from a group known as the Pinkerton Detective Agency to go intimidate the strikers. So the strikers, they go and they start, like protesting the wage cuts, and then Frick sends in the Pinkertons to basically be hired goons to go threaten them and intimidate them. And then he hired people known as scabs. This term is kind of an old union term. A scab was a person who was not a member of the union, and while the union is on strike, they go hire replacements. They go hire these scabs to go take the jobs of the protesters and to go keep the company operating. Then the striking mob, the people who were striking against Carnegie, they attacked the Pinkertons. The Pinkerton Detective Agency were like the hired goons. They killed 3 guards, 9 workers, and ultimately the National Guard was called in to go protect against the strikers and to go reopen the plant. So now you see the National Guard, essentially the military, being called in to go keep the mobs at bay and to go reopen the Carnegie plant. The failed strike, and it was a failed strike, it continued for a couple of more months, but the Pinkertons broke the power of the union, and steelworkers didn't mobilize again for 45 more years after it. Subpoint D, the Pullman Company. You'll remember Pullman from our last unit, the guy that invented the company town to go build the Pullman rail cars. Pullman had his company town that everybody lived in his city, and he had to lay off 3,000 people, and he had to cut wages. But what Pullman didn't do was cut rents. So if you worked in the company town, basically the only job is working for Pullman. And if you get laid off from Pullman, you not only lost your job, but you had to go find a new place to live. You had to move, right? And then other people got their wages cut, but they didn't go and reduce the rents. And they thought, well, this is kind of a crock. I mean, Pullman knows how much I'm getting paid. Why is he suddenly paying me less but not charging me any less in rent? And so it prompted the workers in Pullman to go strike as well. The Pullman Company refused arbitration. They basically refused to negotiate with the strikers. And so the Pullman strike turned violence. And eventually, again, federal troops were called in to go put down the riots. Eugene V. Debs, the head of the Railroad Workers Union, remember his name, Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs was jailed for the strike, most of the workers were fired, and a lot of people were blacklisted, so they could never go work in that business again. Subpoint E, a lot of women were barred from the unions, and most unions didn't allow women members. And so women united behind powerful female leaders. For instance, Mary Harris Jones. Mary Harris Jones was the most prominent organizer in women's labor. She worked for the United Mine Workers, and she led the 1903 Children's March to go expose the reality of labor, child labor. And then you also meet Pauline Newman. Pauline Newman was an organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers and led the 1909 Uprising of the 20,000. It was a seamstress strike, that's hard to say, a seamstress strike for better working conditions. And in 1911, I'm going to introduce this story. We'll talk about it more in a future episode. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught on fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a garment factory in New York, and the garment factory caught on fire. The exits were blocked. and essentially people were trapped inside of a burning building. The fire spread through oily sewing machines and piles of cloth. There was no exit doors, and there was no sprinkler system, and the exit doors were all locked and blocked, and basically trapped 146 working women who died in the tragedy. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory would go set off a reform movement, and I hope to talk more about it soon. Employees were members of unions. Employers, they hated the unions. They tried to use the Sherman Antitrust Act against them. There were legal limitations which would cripple the unions, but membership still rose. This conflict between power holders and the powerless, that conflict is going to break out in a whole bunch of different ways in this unit and beyond. And I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.